Montana Territory, August 1877, the first time Yate Wilder saw her. She was dragging a wooden crate across the dusty main street of Red Elk, her left hand tucked tight into her coat pocket, and her face turned from the sun like it owed her something cruel. He had come into town for nails and a new stirrup strap, but now he stood still beside his gelding, watching her. Folks moved around her like she was not there, like she had become part of the boardwalk, something to pass and never pause for. She grunted as the crate tipped and spilled apples into the dirt. Two boys, no older than 10 or 11, darted forward to help, but their mother yanked them back. "Leave it. That's the scarred girl," she hissed, loud enough to carry. Yate's mouth tightened. He stepped forward. "I got it," the girl said, crouched in the dust, her long brown skirt tangled around her boots. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she tried to gather the fruit. "You do not have to," he said, kneeling beside her. "Let me help." She looked up and he saw the scars. Angry, raised lines ran from her left cheek down to her collarbone, disappearing under her coat, some old, some newer. Her eyes were dark green, sharp like pine needles, and guarded. "I said I got it," she repeated, more tired than angry. He held her gaze. "I believe you. But it is faster with two." They finished gathering the apples in silence. When the crate was upright again, she stood and brushed her skirt off. "Thank you," she said quietly this time. "I am Yate Wilder," he said, holding out his hand. She hesitated, then took it. Her grip was firm despite the tremble. "Maribeth Zane. Nice to meet you, Miss Zane." She gave a single nod, then started to lift the crate again. Yate stepped in front of her. "Let me carry that. Where are you headed?" She opened her mouth to argue, then exhaled. "Back of the bakery. I clean there." Yate lifted the crate and followed her past the smithy, past the saloon where men leaned out to watch, and down a narrow alley to a small shed tucked behind the bakery's rear door. The scent of yeast and wood smoke hung in the air. Maribeth opened the door. Inside was a neat cot, a trunk, and a shelf with a chipped pitcher and bowl. It was barely a room. "You live here?" he asked. She shrugged. "I could be sleeping outside." He set the crate down gently. "That is not what I meant." She turned away, facing the small window. "I do not need pity." "I am not offering any," he said, "just asking questions." She looked at him over her shoulder. "Why?" "Because I do not think it is right that people treat you like a ghost." Maribeth studied him then, like she was trying to decide if he was real. Her hand hovered near her coat collar. "You do not know what happened." "No," he said, "but I would listen if you ever wanted to tell me." She blinked, startled by the offer. "No one wants to hear it. They just see this." She pulled back her coat for the first time, revealing the full stretch of scars down her neck and shoulder. Some were jagged, crisscrossed like a map of pain. Yates stepped closer. "I see them, but I also see you." His voice stayed low. "And I do not think anyone should be pushed aside for something they did not choose." Her chest rose, then stilled. She did not answer. He nodded. "Well, I will be back this way in a few days. If you want, I can bring some coffee. Maybe we could sit out back here and talk some." Maribeth gave a small, uncertain nod. Yate tipped his hat and left. 3 days later he was back with coffee, 2 tin cups, and a bag of molasses biscuits from the general store. Maribeth was sweeping behind the bakery. "You came back," she said, like she had not expected him to. "I said I would." She set the broom aside and joined him on the step. They drank in silence for a while, watching the breeze lift flour dust into the air. "Finally," she said, "my family's barn caught fire when I was 16. I was inside, trying to get my little brother's dog out. The beam fell before I could jump." Yate did not interrupt. "My father told me I was ruined. Said no man would want a girl who looked like she had been carved up. My mother agreed. They sent me off to live with an aunt in Helena. The aunt died 6 months later. She took a sip of coffee, her hand steady now. I came here last year, started cleaning for the bakery. I do not talk to people much. They do not deserve you, Yates said simply. Her eyes flicked to him. You do not flinch when you look at me. He leaned forward slightly. Because I do not see damage, I see stories. Maribeth looked down, her fingers curling around the cup. No one has ever said that. Then they were fools. She laughed, quick and surprised. You are strange. So I have been told. Yates kept visiting. Once a week at first, then twice. They shared coffee, then supper. He brought her a second-hand shawl before the frost came, and she mended his torn shirts in return. He never asked to touch her scars, never stared, never pitied. He asked about her favorite books and if she liked horses. She told him she once dreamed of being a schoolteacher. I think you still could be, he said. Maribeth shook her head. Not with how people look at me. Then we find a place where they look different. Her heart thudded hard at that. One afternoon, he brought her to his ranch, nestled in the foothills outside Red Elk. It was not big, but it was clean and warm, with a barn that smelled of hay and saddle leather. I want to show you something, he said, leading her to the paddock. A chestnut mare stood calmly chewing oats. She is gentle, Yates said. I think you would like her. Maribeth reached out, brushing a hand down the mare's neck. The horse leaned into her touch. What is her name, you choose? She smiled. Fern, Fern it is. That night she stood on his porch, her coat buttoned tight. I should go, she said, but her voice was soft. You could stay, Yates offered. I mean with a proper room, just until the snow lets up. She looked up at him, eyes searching his face. Why are you doing this? Because I like you. Because you make me want to sit still for once in my life. Because I do not think anyone has ever seen how strong you are, and I want to be the man who does. Maribeth stared at him for a long moment. Then she stepped forward and rested her forehead against his chest. His arms closed gently around her. You really mean that? She whispered. I mean every word. She smiled into his shirt. Then maybe I will stay a little while. And in the quiet of that Montana night, with snow drifting down into the pines, something warm and steady began to bloom between them, something strong enough to last. The wind moved in low circles across the pasture, carrying the scent of juniper and old hay. Maribeth stood at the fence, her hands wrapped around a mug Yates had warmed for her on the stove, steam rising into the cold morning air. She wore a wool shawl he'd found at the bottom of a chest in his attic. It was a little frayed along the hem, but she'd folded it over her shoulders like it was something fine. Yates stepped up beside her, his coat unbuttoned. You sleep all right, she nodded, her gaze still on the line of hills to the south. Better than I have in a long while. It's quiet here. He leaned on the rail. That's the one thing this land's never short on. She drank from the mug, then lowered it. I keep thinking someone will come knocking to say I don't belong here. No one's got that say but me, he replied, and I say you do. She turned to look at him, serious. I know you mean well, but I'm not someone most folks welcome around. Especially not in their homes. That's their failing, not yours. I'm not used to being allowed to rest. Then start getting used to it. Neither of them spoke for a while. A hawk passed overhead, wings stretched wide. I overheard the baker's wife once, she said. Said I looked like I'd been licked by fire and left to rot. I pretended I didn't hear it, but it hit like a hammer. Yates' jaw worked tight, but he didn't interrupt. I used to dream about going back and saying something clever, something that would shut her mouth for good, but I never did. I just kept scrubbing her floors. You don't have to scrub for anyone anymore. I know, it's just hard to let the habit go. Her voice softened. Hard to believe I've got a different place now. He turned toward her. You've got one here. I mean that steady. Maribeth studied him, then set the mug down on the fence post. You always this sure about things? No, he said, but I'm sure about you. She reached out slowly, her fingers grazing his gloved hand. "That's still strange to hear." He didn't move away. "Would it help if I showed you what I set up in the East Room?" Her brow lifted slightly. "What did you do?" "Come see." Inside, the cabin had taken on her presence, a scarf draped over the back of a chair, a kettle left to dry on the counter. He led her to the small room off the kitchen. Where once there'd been crates and old tack, now stood a narrow table and a chair, both sanded clean and polished with beeswax. A stack of books sat neatly on one end, alongside a slate and chalk. "I remembered you saying you wanted to teach." She stepped in slowly, fingers trailing the edge of the table. "Where did you find books?" "Traded for them in Deer Lodge last week. Fellow there was giving up his wife's collection. Said they were gathering dust." She picked one up, a worn copy of Pilgrim's Progress. The spine was cracked, but the pages were whole. "You did all this for me?" "I figured a person ought to have a space to do what they were made for." She looked at him, eyes wide. "I haven't written anything in over 2 years." "Well," he said, "no better time to start again." Her voice caught a little as she said, "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything." She stepped across the space and rested her head gently against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, careful and easy. "I'm not used to people thinking I deserve more than survival," she whispered. "You deserve a life." They stood like that, quiet save for the groan of the wind and the ticking stove in the next room. Later that day, she read aloud from the book while he patched a saddle strap by the fire. Her voice was slow at first, uncertain, but it steadied with each page. He listened without interrupting, the rhythm of her words more comforting than the heat from the hearth. When she finally closed the book and looked over at him, she said, "I used to think my voice didn't matter. It matters to me." She smiled, not shy, not hidden, but full and clear. "Then I think I'll read again tomorrow." "I'd like that." That night she didn't close the door to her room. And before the lamps were turned out, she left the book open on the table, a sprig of dried sage marking her place. The ground had hardened under a skin of frost by late September, and the cottonwoods along the creek behind the barn turned the color of brass. Maribeth sat on the porch steps with a length of linen stretched across her lap, needle moving through cloth in careful rhythm. She wasn't mending this time, she was stitching something for herself. A pale blue collar she planned to wear on Sundays if she ever worked up the nerve to walk into the church at the edge of town. Yate came around the side of the house, wiping his hands on a rag. He smelled faintly of axle grease and horses, and there was a fresh scrape across his knuckles. "You cut yourself," she said. "Wheel caught on the axle pin," he replied, glancing at the thin streak of blood. "Nothing deep." She set her sewing aside and stood. "Come inside so I can clean it." "Don't want it turning bad." He followed her in without protest. She poured warm water into the basin, added 2 drops of carbolic, and dipped a clean cloth. Her hands were steady, and she didn't look away as she cleaned the wound. "I used to get scolded for fussing too much over small hurts," she said. "Doesn't feel like fussing, feels like care." She paused, then wrapped his hand gently in a strip of muslin. "You always say things like that, only when they're true." She tied the knot and stepped back. "There. Keep it dry. You're good at this." "I had to be." She folded the cloth into the basin. "When I lived with my aunt, she was sick a lot, cough that never really left her. I learned to make tinctures, poultices. The local doctor said I had a neat hand. Ever think of doing more with it?" She leaned against the counter. "Thought about apprenticing under a healer once. But I didn't have the money, and folks weren't exactly lining up to let someone like me tend their children. Things are different now." She looked at him. "You believe that?" "I do." She reached for the basin and carried it to the back step, tossing the water into the grass. When she turned, he was still standing in the kitchen, looking at her like she was something he'd never thought he'd find. "Yate," she said, quieter now. "What do you want from all this?" He stepped forward, boots slow on the rough floorboards. "I want to build something that lasts. Not just fences and sheds. A life with someone who sees things clear. Someone who doesn't flinch when things get hard." She held his gaze. "I've got sharp corners, so do I. I get quiet when I'm hurt. I won't always know how to say what I feel. I'll wait. And I'm not sure what it means to be wanted like this. Not for pity, not for need. It means I see you and I want to keep seeing you," she swallowed. "I don't know if I can be soft, not the way other women are. I don't need soft. I need real." Something in her chest loosened. She stepped forward and rested her hand against his jaw. "Then you've got me." He leaned into her touch, eyes closed. "I've got you," he said. That night she lit the lamp in the east room and sat at her writing table, pen in hand. Outside, the wind carried a dry rustle through the trees, and the fire in the hearth burned low. She didn't write about the scars or the fire or the years spent shrinking herself to fit other people's comfort. She wrote about the sound of a man's voice when he said her name like it meant something. She wrote about the mare who nuzzled her shoulder each morning. She wrote about the way the world started to shift when someone believed she belonged. And across the hall, Yate lay in bed with the door open, listening to the soft scratch of her pen, knowing she was writing a life they were building together, one day at a time. The frost held longer in the mornings now, clinging to the low grass and the fence rails like fine lace. Maribeth pulled her shawl tighter as she crossed the pasture with a pail of warm mash for Fern. The mare let out a low whicker when she saw her coming, and Maribeth rubbed her nose before setting the pail down. "You're kinder than most people I've known," she murmured to the horse, watching her eat. Not sure what that says about the world. Behind her, the barn door creaked open. "You talking to the livestock again?" Yate called, his voice still rough from sleep. "Better company than townsfolk," she said, standing. He stepped out into the cold, jacket half buttoned, rubbing the back of his neck. "You always get up before the sun, can't seem to stop. Years of habit. You don't have to work so early here." Maribeth smiled faintly. "I know. But I like the quiet before the day starts." Yate watched her brush hay from her skirt. "I meant to ask you something. You know the old schoolhouse near Willow Draw?" She nodded. "The one with the broken bell. County's looking to reopen it. They need someone to teach the younger ones. Just letters and numbers to start. I heard about it when I was in town yesterday." She stilled. "They'd let me teach. They're not choosy. Not with the war taking so many young men off the census rolls and half the women married off or gone east. And they know about." She gestured toward her face without finishing. "They've seen worse. It's a hard valley. Folks here care more about whether you can lead a child to read than how your skin sits." Maribeth looked down at her boots, quiet for a long moment. "I haven't stood in front of a group since before the fire. You'd be standing in front of children, not judges. I'd have to ride out there alone. I'll take you the first day, and the second if you need." She glanced up at him, the rising sun catching the edge of her cheek. "You think I can do it?" "I know you can." He said nothing more, just watched her as she weighed the thought. She reached out and touched Fern's neck again, absently smoothing the mane between her fingers. "When would they want someone to start?" "End of next week." "Gives you time to think it through." "I don't need more time." She turned to face him fully. "I'll do it." Yate's eyes softened. "Then we'll ride out tomorrow. You can look over the place, meet the board. I'll stand quiet beside you if that helps." Maribeth nodded once. "It does." They walked back toward the cabin together, boots crunching on frost, breath rising in clouds. Inside, the fire had gone low and she crouched to feed it with split pine. "You ever think about building a life out here?" she asked without looking up. Yate leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. I have. More so lately. You ever think about what kind of life? I think about a home that doesn't go quiet when you walk in. I think about someone reading beside the fire while stew simmers. I think about children with your eyes asking for another story. She added another log and stood. You don't talk much about your past, she said. Not much to say. Grew up near the Judith River. Father drank too much. Mother left when I was 13. I stayed with the land. Learned it won't lie to you the way people do. Why'd you come to Red Elk? Looking for something I didn't have words for then. Did you find it? He took a step closer, close enough she could hear the hitch of breath before he spoke. I think I did. Maribeth's hand drifted to the locket at her neck, newer, copper, a gift from him 2 weeks back. Inside was a pressed sprig of prairie clover and his mother's initials etched on a folded scrap of paper. You never asked me to stay, she said. You never asked to leave. She reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. Then maybe we both already decided. He brought her hand to his chest and held it there. Outside, the frost began to melt, drip by slow drip off the eaves. The schoolhouse at Willow Draw stood crooked on its stones, but the boards were solid and the roof held tight. The bell still didn't ring, but someone had scraped the windows clean and patched the worst of the cracks with linen and beeswax. Maribeth stepped over the threshold with her satchel pressed to her hip. Yate just behind her, his palm warm against the small of her back. Inside, 4 benches faced a black-painted wall, and a pot-belly stove crouched in the corner like a faithful dog waiting to be lit. A row of small boots crowded near the door, some worn to the nail. Maribeth stepped forward and touched the ledge where the slates would rest. I remember rooms like this, she said, her voice hushed. I used to sit right in front, afraid to miss a word. You don't look afraid now, said Yate. She glanced at him. I am. Just not the same kind. A thin woman with loose curls pinned under a bonnet came in through the side door. Her apron was flour-dusted, but her handshake was firm. Name's Hester Lang. Been running the Draws ledger board since my husband passed. Heard you might be willing to teach, Maribeth nodded. I'll do my best, Hester studied her. Ain't about best, it's about showing up and not breaking. The children here they've known too much leaving. I don't leave, Maribeth said, the woman's eyes softened. Then you'll do fine. The children came 2 mornings later, some on foot, others bundled into wagons. Maribeth stood in the doorway and watched them approach, her fingers tight around a stick of chalk. Yate had ridden out with her again, but this time he remained outside, tending fern beside the fence, letting her stand alone. By the time the sun tipped past the cottonwoods, Maribeth had taught 6 children the shape of the letter A, soothed one bloody nose, and learned that Ruthie Bell cried when she missed her father. When the last child had gone, she leaned against the doorframe, her shoulders aching in a way that felt earned. Yate handed her a tin of water. You look like someone who just finished plowing a mile of field. It's harder than I remembered, she said. But right. He helped her up into the saddle. Feels like something you'll grow into. She looked over at him. I think I already am. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm marked by the scrape of chalk, the clatter of boots, and the soft hush of autumn wind. Maribeth filled the room with stories, some from the books Yate had brought, others from her own memory. The children listened, wide-eyed, even when the light faded early. One evening, as they rode home beneath a sky streaked with ember-colored clouds, she turned to Yate and said, I've been thinking about the land east of your barn. The slope near the alder grove, she nodded. It gets good light. And it's far enough from the main house that it'd stay quiet. What are you thinking? I'd like to plant there in spring. Corn, maybe, beans to start. I want something that's ours. He took her hand in his, reins loose. Then we'll plant it. That winter, the cabin filled with new sounds, the scratch of her pen as she kept records for the school, the creak of the loom she'd bought in trade for a set of lesson readers, the slow, steady rhythm of their feet moving around each other in the narrow kitchen. One night after supper, Yates set down his spoon and said, "I'd like to marry you come spring." Maribeth looked up from her sewing. "You don't have to say that. I know I want to." She was quiet a long moment. "I don't want a big gathering. Just us and a preacher then. And I want to keep teaching, not just until planting. I wouldn't ask you to stop. And if children come, we'll raise them together. Teach them to read and ride and keep their word." She touched the place where her scars met the collar of her dress. "I used to think no one would look at me and see more than this." He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "I look at you and see my future." They wed in April beneath the blooming chokecherry trees. Hester came, along with Ruthie Bell and the other children, who scattered petals along the grass. Maribeth wore her blue collar, the one she'd sewn that first fall, and Yate wore his father's vest, the buttons polished and warm from his hands. They built the garden together, and by midsummer, beans curled around the posts she'd set with string. She taught through another year, then another, the schoolhouse growing to hold a dozen children, then 15. When their first daughter was born on a rain-soft morning, Yate held her close and whispered that her name would be Clara, for the light she brought. Maribeth watched them both, her heart so full it ached. Years later, the cabin still stood, the porch worn smooth by footsteps and sun. The schoolhouse bell had been fixed by then, and Clara helped ring it every morning before lessons began. Maribeth and Yates sat together on the porch swing most evenings, her hand always resting in his, the silence between them full of comfort, not lack. No one ever called her ruined again, and she never left.